I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics. We're very honored today to have as our guest the Honorable Lauren Bubba McDonald, longtime member of the Georgia House of Representatives and a member of the Public Service Commission. Welcome, Bubba. We're delighted to have you.
My pleasure, Bob. Thank you so very much. It's quite an honor for me.
Good. You know something, Bubba? Besides being longtime personal and political friends, we have something else in common.
What's
Commerce,
that?
Georgia.
Oh, absolutely.
Commerce.
What's your relationship with Commerce?
Well, my grandparents lived in Commerce, Georgia, and most of their lives. And I hope you knew them, Mr. Charlie Short and
Absolutely.
and his wife.
Absolutely.
But we aren't here to talk about them. We're here to talk about you. You were born in Commerce, grew up in Commerce. Tell us a little about your early life.
Well, I was born in Commerce in 1938. I was born on Thanksgiving Day, and knocked my father out of a bird hunting trip, and he was not happy about that. Grew up there. I had an older sister named Shirley, and she's the one that named me Bubba. She didn't say brother, she said Bubba, and it kind of took and stuck. So I've lived with that all these years. Commerce schools, graduated from Commerce High School. Unfortunately, my mother passed away when I was 12. She was 39 years old and she had cancer. And my father never remarried. He was in the hardware business, and he married the same year that I married. He married his golfing partner's widow. I married in 1964 to Sonny Nivens, a school teacher, a Brenau graduate from Gainesville, Georgia. And before that time, I was at the University of Georgia. Played in the Dixie Redcoat Band, and that's the Redcoat Band. I played in a dance group called the Twilighters. I was the trombone player and male vocalist for the group, and made good money back then, back in the mid-50s, 58, 57, 59. Went in the Air Force in 59, spent some time in the Air Force. I was between the Korean conflict and the Vietnam conflict. I was in the Georgia Air National Guard. And after graduating from the University of Georgia, I went back into the business with my father in the hardware and build supply business. Well, Sonny and I married in 1964, and right after that, Floyd Howard was the district attorney in Jackson County. And Floyd was murdered. He was blown to death. And then that time the sheriff was resigned from office. Governor Maddox was governor of Georgia. The ordinary of the county was Judge Griffith. At that time, under Georgia law, the ordinary of the county would appoint an interim sheriff until one could be elected. I was 27 years old, and Judge Griffith asked me if I would take that interim sheriff position. Well, it just scared my wife to death and scared my father because of the tragedy that had happened. And I turned that down. But in 1968, I got up one morning, and of course it was very unusual for me to put on a tie unless I was going to church. And my wife said, "What are you putting on a tie for?" I said, "I'm going to qualify." She said, "Qualify for what?" I said, "I'm going to qualify for county commission." And I ran for county commission. I said, "I want to make a difference in this county, and we don't deserve what we've had." And so I was successful in that election. At that time, Bob, it was the Commissioner of Roads and Revenue. And timing is so important in everything. Maddox again was still governor, and I was invited when I was elected to speak at the first annual conference of county commissioners because at that time I was the youngest county commissioner in the state. And why a young person wants to be involved in county government, you know. And so I had a keynote speech at the convention. Hugh Logan from Athens, Georgia was president of the convention at that time. And there was a vacancy on the 9th District Board of Managers of the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia. And I was elected to fill that spot as a freshman county commissioner. Well, I sat at the table with the Ira Breedloves and the Tom Callaways from Decatur and all these veteran county commissioners on that board. Then my neighbor, Mac Barber, decided to run for Comptroller General, which is now Insurance Commissioner. And so this was in 1970. And so I ran for his seat in the Georgia House of Representatives and was elected there and was seated in 1971. George L. Smith was the Speaker of the House. And I remember, you know, those times they had gone through the thing with seating Julian Bond. When I went in to get my seat assignment, George L. asked me if I had any problem sitting next to a black, in which I did not. Bill Alexander was my seatmate on my left. He was Superior Court judge in Fulton County. And then J.C. Daughtery next to him. And then Julian Bond was right on over on the left side. And Jack Gunner from Toccoa, who was Superior Court judge later, was on my right. But I served under George L. And then, of course, George L. passed away, and then Speaker Murphy was Speaker Pro Tem, and he became Speaker. Probably one of the most exciting and satisfying things that happened to me legislatively was in my earlier days. Jackson County had a bad problem with car theft. I mean, it was noted as the car theft capital of the world. And it wasn't reflective on the quality of people that were in that county. So I introduced a local constitutional amendment giving the Georgia Bureau of Investigation total arrest authority in Jackson County. The law at that time said that the only way the GBI would involve themselves if they were invited in either by the sheriff or the Superior Court judge or the district attorney. They just didn't go in and start investigating and things of that nature. It was a very, very controversial piece of legislation. It was a local legislation. I remember my colleague Lamar Northcutt was the executive director of the Georgia Sheriff's Association, but he was a legislator from Clayton County. And Lamar objected, of course, to my local legislation. And so it was sent back to committee. Elliot Levitas was chairman of the State Planning and Community Affairs Committee. And Jack Ello was clerk of the House from Clarksville, Georgia. And they knew how important this piece of legislation was for me. Georgia Sheriff's Association, of course, opposed it strongly. But they helped me get it back through the committee and back on the calendar. And it passed, and even Lamar Northcutt voted for it. He didn't know it. I mean, it was one of those times, you know, you're voting on local bills, and he didn't expect it to be back and wasn't paying that close of attention. And it passed. And it passed in the ballot box 6-1 when it was put on the ballot in Jackson County. The GBI came in with the FBI and cleaned everything up, and we eliminated that. That was a very, very proud time in my life. It was very controversial. Then later, the most other controversial local legislation I did, we had 3 school systems: City of Commerce, City of Jefferson, and Jackson County. And I was going to consolidate all of those school systems. Busby was governor at this time, and I had some strong commitments from Busby. State Department of Education was totally for it. It was put to referendum, had to be passed in the 3 different school districts. It passed in 2 and failed in the county system by about 179 votes. Very unfortunate in my opinion, It was a very controversial piece of local legislation. I had the windows shot out in my business twice, the plate glass windows during that period of time. But, and unfortunately it didn't pass, and it still has 3 school systems in it. But from the state's perspective standpoint, another great tribute to me was that I was chosen to be in the charter class of Leadership Georgia. Dr. J.W. Fanning, who was quite a person and one of my favorite people. Sam Nunn and I were 2 legislators that were in the charter class of Leadership Georgia. This was in 1972. And of course, here we are in 2008, and Leadership Georgia has just flourished all over the state in a great, great program. Another big part of my legislative life was still in the mid-70s. Dean Fluellen, the dean of the business school at the University of Georgia, Dr. Fluellen and I talked, and we came up with the vision of the Small Business Development Center, the SBDC. And I did the enabling legislation or resolution that created the SBDC and served on its board until a couple of years ago when I just stepped aside from it. But it was the model that the United States used. Dean Fluellen and I visited with Larry Bramlett. I went to Washington, the White House, when Mr. Carter was president, and Sam Nunn was kind of leading that. He led the effort at the national level to create the Small Business Development Administration. And so that was another piece of the puzzle that I'm very proud of. Then Speaker Murphy appointed me as chairman of the Industry Committee. And Industry Committee handles basically most utility legislation and other regulatory pieces. And I did that for 5 years. I remember we had a bill that was to expand the Industrial Development Authority bonds, whereby that if you were contiguous with, like the Merchandise Mart in Atlanta, you could build on tax-free bonds. Days Inn, Richard Kessler went to the speaker, and they wanted to do this with a Days Inn downtown Atlanta on International Avenue. And Speaker called me in and said, let's help get this bill. I said, Mr. Speaker, it's a bad bill. We don't need to get this bill out. And he said, well, yeah, it'd be all right. He says, you know, my people from Bremen, they can't afford to stay in that Peachtree Plaza. They need a Days Inn down there. And I said, well, Mr. Speaker, we're going to keep diluting this bill, this program, and the feds are going to take it away from us. We were getting arbitrage off of it and things of that nature. And he said, well, just go ahead and get the bill. I said, well, I can't defend the bill on the floor of the House because I'm opposed to it. He said, well, get somebody else to do it. Be sick that day or something, you know. I said, no, I'm not going to get the bill out, Mr. Speaker. He said, well, you're going to force me to have to come to your committee. I said, no, Mr. Speaker, don't come to the committee. He said, I'm coming if you don't get it out. I said, well, I guess you're going to come because I'm not going to get it out, Mr. Speaker. Anyway, I had people like Johnny Isaacson, Carl Harrison, Charlie Mann from Elberton, Frank Horn from Macon, Sonny Watson from Warner Robins, all these. Hosea Williams was on my committee. And I really had the speaker beat when he came up there by my count. But I had 2 of my friends that feather-legged on me, and they just couldn't handle the pressure from the speaker, and Bill got out. The funny thing about it was that Richard Kessler had made such a dire need that Days Inn couldn't do it unless they had these IDBs. Wasn't long that Joe Frank Harris was running for governor. Bo Ginn was running, saw where Richard Kessler with Days Inn had given Bo Ginn a big contribution to the campaign. And then they had a big article in the paper where how profitable Days Inn was and everything. And I showed all those to the speaker, and he just chunked that cigar and munched a little bit. But those were fun times. And then of course the real caveat was when he called me and I was at home on a Friday afternoon about 5 o'clock, and he said, son, I want you to be my appropriations chairman. And I chaired the appropriations committee for the next 8 years.
Let's talk about that for a minute. Let's talk about how your committee and the legislature appropriates the taxpayers' money? What's the process?
Well, of course, you know the governor sets the budget. He sets the revenue estimate and presents a budget. The judiciary presents its own budget to the governor, and he has to incorporate that into the budget. He doesn't mess with the judiciary budget. Then it comes to the House of Representatives. We can work within the framework of the revenue estimate. We cannot appropriate outside the revenue estimate. But the budget changes form from the time the governor prepares it till when it's in the House. And we go through the hearing processes with the different agencies, state agencies and everything. I get amused, a little side note, I get amused about even today the media so worried about lobbyists. The biggest lobby we have is government. Government itself, the university system, the school systems, the agencies within state government themselves. I mean, they just, when I was, during my time as chairman, everybody knew I was in my business on Saturday. Nothing unusual for the chancellor of the university system to come walking in my hardware and building supply business in Commerce, Georgia, or the president of the university, or the director of the Agorama in Tifton, Georgia, or something like that. It was just nothing uncommon. But then the House develops its own version, and of course there was the infamous Green Door Committee. And the Green Door Committee was made up of some speakers, select people that once the Appropriations Committee set a budget in place, then the Green Door Committee would look at it and even massage it even a bit further. And then the budget goes to the Senate, and the Senate does their thing with it, and then it goes to a conference committee. And then there are 3 members from the House and 3 members from the Senate that literally can rewrite the entire budget right there after it's gone through the whole process. And those days sometimes would get very long. You'd get to the end of the session and the budget would be one of the last things that was hanging out there. My colleague across the hall was Terrell Starr. Senator Starr was chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. And Senator Starr and I worked very closely together. We had confidence in each other. We confided in each other. And of course, Zell Miller was lieutenant governor at that time. And we would get in some stagnation points of hours over $10,000 in the budget, out of a $7 billion budget or $9 billion budget. And I went to Zell and I said, you know, the Senate's got to have some things, they've got to make changes, and it's going to happen. The same as the House. And we set aside an agreement of dollars in the budget, which were really minuscule, but when you're looking at, Bob, just like this morning's news today, 2008 May, I noticed that the World Congress Center just spent $100 million on remodeling the damage from the tornado. That was the same amount of money that was spent to build phase 1 and phase 2 of the World Congress Center. Because I was in the General Assembly when we appropriated the first $30 million to build a World Congress Center, and the second phase was $70 million. And so we spent $100 million just to do what we did to build the first 2 phases of the World Congress Center. But so Zell and I agreed that, and I went back with my committee and conference committee, and so we eliminated that what we call chicken dancing between the budget process, and I'm real proud we got budgets out 2 and 3 days before the legislative session was over.
Let's go back, Bubba, if you will, to your first year in the House of Representatives. Jimmy Carter was governor.
Correct.
Lester Maddox was lieutenant governor. And all of the news during that time was of the bitter feud that those two had going. What do you remember about that?
Well, you know, it was very interesting, and I spent my first week in the hotel, where everybody stayed at the
Henry Grady.
Henry Grady Hotel. And of course, that's where Speaker Smith stayed. But I couldn't stand it. I had to get out of there. So I moved to the Holiday Inn. And Speaker Murphy was at, Speaker Pro Tem Murphy was at the Holiday Inn. Howard Johnson, excuse me, south of where the Turner Field is now. And Sam Nunn, Carlton Caldwell, Elliot Levitas, Mike Egan, Grace Hamilton, President Carter had going through reorganization of state government, and he had a group of what was called, Speaker Murphy called them 13 Disciples of Carter. And we would meet and discuss issues that the governor put before us, come up with some suggestions and everything. And in that process, there were times I remember that the 13 of us would have a unanimous position on it, and Mr. Carter would go 180 degrees in a different direction.
This was on his reorganization bill.
That and some of the other things, yes.
Yeah.
But it kind of sets the tone as to how Mr. Carter, as governor, never did have a rapport with the legislature, i.e. the Senate or the House. I never will forget a time that Mr. Carter was one of his sons, and he had him around the Capitol, came up to James Sloppy Floyd, who was appropriations chairman, and tagged him on the shoulder and says, "Daddy wants to see you downstairs." And of course, James Sloppy Floyd, number one, that just went, you know what happened there. But anyway, and then, you know, in my opinion, unfortunately, when he got to the presidency, he still had that same problem. He never created a rapport with Congress, you know, and of course, you look at Carter and you look at Maddox as lieutenant governor, and then you spend time with Tom Murphy as speaker and Zell as lieutenant governor and head of the Senate. And from a public standpoint, you would think that they were ready to draw knives and swords and go each other. They worked close together. I mean, if you were privileged, like I was privileged to be behind the scenes and see what was going on, and there was great respect on both sides for each other. And that's what. And you think back and look at Georgia. Not because I was there for 20 years, but look at Georgia from 1970 to 1990 and look what happened to Georgia in this period of time, the growth, the expansion, what happened to our university systems, what happened to our technical schools that developed all over the state, trying to put one within 50 miles of every child that wants to go to college or advance their education beyond the high school, you know. This happened. Our economic growth, even though there was the mid-'70s recession in there that we experienced and had to cut back in state budget and everything, we had the developmental highway program. Completing the interstate through downtown Atlanta was just a magnificent project where we appropriated advanced funding to draw down the federal funds. Tom Moreland was the instigator and mover and shaker on that. I mean, there was just tremendous things that are there today that were done in that period of time.
Let's talk a minute about some of the governors with whom you served. George Busbee.
A delight. George was a good governor his first 6 years. His first term and then 2 years into his second term. And then he wasn't, you know, Zell was governor till the day he left the office. George wasn't as active in he was, I think he was doing more to build his tomorrow than the state's stuff the last 2 years. Did a lot for expanding economic development in our state. And of course, these are my opinions. These are not opinions of anybody else. Love George Busbee. I remember a piece of legislation, the Consumer Utility Council, when I was industry chairman, it was one of those that had a sunset unless you extended it. And I had the bill before my committee, and I wasn't going to let it out, and got a call to come to the governor's office, and Busbee pushed me real hard about wanting to get that bill out. And Representative Sonny Watson from Warner Robins was my vice chairman, and he was with me in the governor's office. And George just got all upset, and when I told him, I said, well, Governor, I am not going to let that bill out of committee. And he took his glasses off and he threw them across the room in the governor's office. They broke into 1,000 pieces. And he said, I will create by executive order. And I said, well, that's what you're going to have to do. and of course, we were great friends. I mean, great friends. And George was a good governor, did a lot of good for the economic development of our state. Knew the process because he'd been in the General Assembly for many, many years. We had something in common, both of us being pilots, and we always had something to talk about. Good conversation.
Joe Frank Harris.
Well, you know, Joe Frank was the kind that just kind of let things happen. You could count on Joe Frank. He didn't get upset. He was very dedicated to his job. Of course, a model person in his character, and his and Elizabeth's character. Not saying that any of the rest of them weren't, but Joe Frank was that. I had an experience with the Governor Harris, when the superintendent of education passed away during a legislative session, and I went to the governor. And I said, Governor, there's a time right now that you can, in my opinion, you can make a tremendous difference in this state. I said, somewhere out there, there's a successful corporate head or business person that started out in the School of Education and has the credentials that would qualify that person, has taught a year to be superintendent of the state schools. And I said, I think it would be great if we went out there and found this business person to come in and manage the educational program in this state. And I said, I beg of you to do this. But he didn't do that. He appointed from within. And of course, that's fine, well and good. But those are one of the things I thought would really make a big difference. If it's just business. Running a department of education, running a department of human resources, running any of these things, you don't have to be the best teacher or the most experienced in education. You got to run a business. You got people and that you can put into those places in those different areas of expertise if you manage the program. And that's what it's, in my opinion, what it's all about.
He was succeeded by Zell Miller. How about Governor Miller?
A delight. Of course, as you know, I ran for governor in 1990 when Governor Miller was elected. There was Roy Barnes in the race, Andrew Young, Lester Maddox. On the Republican side, Johnny Isaacson, Greeley Ellis, Bob Wood. And the experience for me in that period of time was just awesome, to go around the state of Georgia. And I would even find myself at times defending Zell when we would be in a debate on monetary things. I remember Governor Barnes was getting on Zell about some salary bill or something, and I whispered to Zell, I said, he's the one that introduced it in the Senate. and had a good time. Of course, I was flying my little Cessna 182 Skylane, and my good friend Zell and Roy and those were coming in on the King Airs when we'd go to different places around the state, and I'd get out as pilot and then get out as candidate and do the thing, then get back in, and I'd watch them go off into the sunset in those big turboprop jobs and hear my little 182 Skylane. But it was great experience. Zell was a great governor of Georgia. Zell was a working governor of Georgia. Zell taught me an awful lot. Of course, I became president of Georgians for Better Transportation, and after I finished that race of government, back in my business at home, and then the group of business people came to me and asked me if I would head up the GBT, and they gave me the latitude to make sure that my own business, was number one priority. And I did that, and so I worked very closely with Zell. I remember being called into his office when Wayne Shackelford was being promoted to be the Commissioner of Transportation, and Zell wanted us to give a letter of endorsement for Wayne, and which we did gladly do so. But you gotta hand it to Zell. He was a go-getter, still is, proudly. Thank goodness. And of course, you know the story that I was still working in my business and president of GBT, and I got a call from the governor to come see him, and this was in 1998. I had just sold my business in May of 1998, the hardware and bill supply business in Commerce. My son, Lauren III, did not want anything to do with the hardware business. He graduated from the University of Georgia, political science major. I asked him, I said, son, what are you going to do? He says, I want to be a funeral director. I said, do what? And he had to go 3 more years to get his certification to be a licensed mortician and funeral director. And so when he came back, we looked at home where I'd lived all my life, but the numbers just weren't there to do that. So we went to Cumming, Georgia, and went in business there in '97. Cold turkey, never been in the business before, didn't know 25 to 30 people in the whole county there. Of course, Forsyth County had changed so much over the period of time. And we knew that 80% of the population hadn't lived there 20 years. There was only one other establishment in Forsyth County. It had been there 70-something years, and it was very popular. And it was a real struggle for 3 years. I mean, it took us a little time, but I'd sold my business in May, but the buyers didn't want to take over until August of '98 and didn't want it to be known. But I knew when Zell offered me the opportunity to serve on the Public Service Commission, but I first turned him down. I told him I just didn't think I wanted to get back into it. I went back home, got a call from him again to come back, and he said, let me tell you, Bubba, what I'm looking for. He said, I'm looking for someone that has run a successful business, and you've done that. He said, I'm looking for somebody that understands state government, and you do that. And he said, you can't turn me down on this job. I want you to do this. And he said, I got people beating the door down, wanting this, and you're standing here turning me down? I was leaving, going on a blue marlin fishing trip that afternoon. And I told him, I said, well, Governor, I'll call you before the weekend's over. I called Johnny Isaacson on that trip. Johnny was, again, in the 1990 governor's race with us. Then he was appointed by Zell to chair the state school board. And this was when the Shrinko and all the confusion was going on the state school board level. And Johnny was brought in there to calm the waters. And this is the mark of a good leader. Zell Miller, he goes in and he picks out talent to do different things. A lot of people are scared to pick out talent. They're scared that they'll show them up or something like that. Not Zell Miller. But anyway, so I was on the trip. I'd called Johnny and I said, Johnny, what kind of support did the governor give you when you went to the school board to try to solve those problems? And he said it was just absolutely great. Said he was just fantastic. And I said, okay. And I told Johnny what my situation was. And so I called Zell. He'd given me a cell phone number, to call him. And I called him. I said, well, Governor, I'll accept the appointment. He said, good. I want to swear you in Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. He said, I got to get this over with. Anyway, so we went forward from there. But he was just, and I told him this was in June of '98. Well, he was going out of office in December. Well, the commission had just put on, had laid on its platter the gas deregulation. General Assembly had passed gas deregulation. It was Sonny Perdue's legislation as a state senator, and then it was the commission's Public Service Commission to implement the program. Well, I got there right at implementation time, and of course it was a drastic change in the delivery of natural gas, and very controversial and all this kind of business, and a lot of hearing hours and a lot of ears bent. And so in December, I was talking to Governor Miller in December, and I said, well, Governor, you know, it took me 6 months to figure out why you wanted me to do this. And he said, Bubba, what do you mean? I said, you just got even with me for running against you for governor in 1990, didn't you? Because we had a big laugh about that and everything.
Well, I would say, and I might be wrong, but I think that the Public Service Commission's decisions probably affects the pocketbooks of Georgians more than any other agency.
Well, it will equal up to any, and there's a misconception, Bob, to some degree about the Public Service Commission. We operate under the policies that's set by the General Assembly of Georgia and the governor. But the responsibility is you have a company, i.e. a Georgia Power, that you regulate, and you have the consumer over here. I'm a consumer. I'm as big a consumer as anybody out there. But the law says that we have to find whereby that the company, i.e. the monopoly that we regulate, has a right of return on equity, a fair amount. Now, our job is to go in and make sure that they are running the business in the most frugal manner that they can run and deliver the service. And then when you think and look at the population growth of Georgia over the last 50 years, you just don't go out here and build a generation plant in 2 weeks. You've got to be way out there in front. And so this is where the confusion comes in. And when the power company, and then the state passed a fuel clause where if coal goes up or natural gas goes up, the power company can pass that to the consumer. It's the only place they can pass it to. And that's state law. But we have to make sure, the commission has to make sure that it's done, their bid process, their purchases, like in my business, in the hardware business, the best way that I can serve my people is to make sure that I'm buying at the right price so that I can sell at the right price. And I have to make a profit. I can't stay in business unless I make a profit. Well, the power company can't do it either. So the commission has a balancing act to do. And then you have, when you look the other side of it is, you look at the industry, the economic development of your state. If you don't have a proper resource of almost a guarantee of 25 years or 50 years down the road, you're not going to have any economic expansion. One of the key players in economic growth, whether it's a China company, a Korean company, or an Alabama company moving to Georgia, is, hey, I got to have a reliable source of energy. And people want that light to come on when they flick that switch. And so it's a balancing act, and it's a very responsible position to be in.
Well, the Public Service Commission is often criticized for lobbyists. Is there any reason to be concerned about that?
Well, if you're a Christian, you go to church to hear the preacher. And the preacher shares different views on the scripture. If you are a businessman, you go to an advertising agency that specializes in this to get you the best marketing plan that you can do for your business. Now, to be a public service commissioner, to be a legislator, if you don't depend on the people that are working, yes, there are those that have their selfish position, but that's what you are supposed to do, is to hear their position, hear this position, look and research to your best degree that you can with your staff, looking at both sides of it, inside out, upside down, and then make a decision. In electricity, you can follow the money line. Electricity is the same today as it was 50 years ago. That kilowatt is the same thing. There's different delivery of it. There's different methods of generating that kilowatt, but it's the same. Natural gas, same thing it was. It comes out of the ground. It's the same. Delivery systems have changed, but natural gas is the same gas that it is. The telecom industry is a total different ballgame. It changes every day, and it is most difficult to keep the human. David Burgess, a former public service commissioner, graduate of Georgia Tech. He was a staff employee with the commission for many years, and David knew more about telecom than 12 commissioners thrown in the same barrel over the last 15 years in his own mind. David could have just been anything he wanted to in the telecom industry, but he loved working in state government. And these are the kind of issues, Bob, that whether does the President of the United States, does he make every decision just on, he's got experts that he listens to in different fields. He listens to General Petraeus on the Iraq situation like that. And this is what so back to your question, lobbyists provide a function. Is it abused? Sure, it's abused. But who's the abuser? You can, as a legislator, you can do what you want to and let that influence. But if people know your character and they know that you're going to make a fair decision, they're not going to always get their way. The company's not going to get its way. My first rate case when the Georgia Power Company in 1999 reduced the revenues of the power company over $800 million. Where'd that go? It went back to the consumer. We were paying less for electricity on a per kilowatt hour when I left the commission in 2002 than we were paying in 1990. Now, today, 2008, it's not the case. You've had high cost of natural gas has gone up. Crude oil is rocket changes every day, and you've got gas-fired generation systems. You've got coal-fired generation systems. The cost of transportation, diesel fuel gone up. Trains run on diesel. Getting coal from the mine to the hoppers of the power company. The amount of money that has been required by your generation companies from the EPA to change the emissions, and it costs X billions of dollars to reduce emissions by this much, and then they want it reduced this much more, and it costs 3 times more to reduce it that much more than it costs to do it this way. Hey, it's an exercise.
What do you think about nuclear power?
It's got to happen. We have a nuclear plant in Georgia. It was very costly. We've got to look at France. We've got to look. It needs to be boilerplate, not build a nuclear plant and manufacture each part on its own. You got to have boilerplate. Westinghouse that develops a nuclear system that can be in Alabama or Tennessee or wherever it is that it's mass production of these things. I happened to be privileged to be on the electric committee of NARUC when I was in the commission. NARUC is the National Organization of Utility Regulators. I was appointed by the president to, on the electric committee, I was chairman of the subcommittee on nuclear energy and nuclear waste. I've been to Yucca Mountain in Nevada where nuclear waste is to be buried. the scientists. To me, it's foolproof. It's amazing. It's amazing. I've been to the Atmos industry in Idaho, where they have split the atom and they're recycling and reusing nuclear spent fuel. Then the president of NARUC appointed me to serve on what's called the NEAL Committee. NEAL Committee is the Nuclear Electric Liability Insurance Group. And they're based out of Bermuda, but they insure nuclear plants all over the world. And their reserves at the time when I left in 2002, their reserves were over $7 billion that they had in reserves. And they were refunding premiums to nuclear plants over the world because their reserves were so full and there had been no accidents, and it was so safe. The technology has brought it to safety. Well, it's the cleanest, in my opinion, and it's just something that it's the need that we have for tomorrow's generation. Yes, we still look at solar. We look at wind. We got to continue the technology that's available out there and new technology, but nuclear has got to expand.
Well, getting back to the politics of it, do you think that the voters can be trusted to elect the right people to serve on the Public Service Commission, or should they be appointed?
Bob, I would never take anything away from the voters. It's just like why I had never wanted to support term limits. In my opinion, term limits remove the voter of the responsibility of exercising a right as an American to express themselves. You may have someone that has done a fabulous job and you have a 6-year limitation on their service as far as, and yet because of that limitation, they can't go forward. I think that term limits are not good. I know everybody says, well, incumbents. Our problem now, in my opinion, is that we're trying to overregulate public service at all levels. We're in 2008. A congressperson shouldn't have to run for every 2 years, in my opinion. It's so costly, and you don't get the job done. Congress needs to limit their days like the Georgia legislature does. Go back to it being a volunteer Congress and have so much time. You'll get the same amount of work done. They could have 6 months up there and 6 months at home, and we'd get the same job done. The 40-day, don't ever let the 40-day legislative days expand in Georgia. We won't create a bit more progress by doing that. And it's just getting people to give themselves, and it's an awesome responsibility when you give yourself for your families. I've had the privilege of speaking to incoming legislators about their coming in, and they would be sitting there with their spouses. And I'd say, look around the room. You got professional people, you got business people, you got families, you got husbands and wives, you got sober people. Some of you going home drunk. Some of you going home with a broken marriage. Some of you going home because you've lost your business or lost your practice, because you get too involved and you let your ego and everything run away with you. And this has happened. I've served with them. I could call their names of people that just great people that let their involvement get away from them. You've got to have a strong discipline. And that's not only in a legislative branch or a commissioner of public service or a governor. That's life. You've got to have that discipline.
Well, you and I believe, 2 years, were forced to run again, or to run for election for that seat that you're appointed to.
It was 4.5 years.
4.5 years.
Well, I had to run within 6 months.
Yeah.
I had to run the next
Yeah.
cycle of election, and
Right.
I was elected to that, but it's public service is a 6-year term.
But you were overwhelmingly elected to fill, was it the remainder of an unexpired term?
Correct.
Yeah, so then you ran again,
Right.
and unfortunately, you were defeated.
Well, it happens when you if you don't want to get tackled, don't play football.
And
I have had a wonderful time in public service. One, I had a wife and a son that was very supportive, that were understanding. That the wife took the phone calls at night when I was out doing something else. I had a wonderful experience in that time in my church as choir director, elder, doing these things. I was fortunate in having a business that was profitable. I had good people working with me that made it possible that I could do some of these other things. And it'd be so bad to be in this world by yourself. It would be so bad. And when my toes are turned up, Bob, raise the glass and say, oh boy, I had a good ride, because Georgia has been so great to me, and I've experienced seeing it grow and the quality of growth, and the county that my business is in over there. Forbes magazine just a short time ago recognized it as the 13th most affluent county in the nation. Timing, good decisions, hard work, discipline makes things happen. And it's the opportunities out there for anybody. Out there for anybody.
we didn't speak of Roy Barnes. How was he as a governor?
Roy is as intelligent of a governor as Georgia's ever had. Roy is a brilliant person himself. Roy and I had some difficulties on issues. I don't know whether it was a carryover from the governor's race, that he may have felt like that because I was in that race that it diluted his position of being a winner, or even in the runoff when Andy Young and Zell win the runoff together. I don't know, but Roy, in my opinion, smart, was more political in his governorship than most of them. I think Zell was far more business, less politics. Joe Frank was pretty much stable, and his politics wasn't that strong. I think Roy was weighted more political than he did as far as the business is concerned. Disappointed in one thing that I love that Roy did is that and my wife was a 30-year classroom school teacher, and she didn't need tenure to continue her work in school. And I think when Roy got the legislation passed that abolished tenure in the education system was a great piece of legislation. Of course, it was when Governor Perdue came in, he brought it back in, but that was gutsy. And 80% of our teachers are great teachers and dedicated teachers. But as an appropriations chairman, when we would do a deservingly raise for school teachers, we had to raise the bottom at the same time we raised the top. And in business, you don't do that.
Well, the flag issue was gutsy too.
Oh yes, very much so, very much so. Absolutely.
And some people think that those two things that you mentioned helped Roy become defeated by Governor Perdue. Now,
Well, and I guess you can look at some successful business people. Arrogance has a little bit to do with it. And Roy had the reputation of being a small part of being a little arrogant, but I can't take anything away from his abilities and his intelligence. He was and is a very intelligent person.
Well, before we move along, let's talk a minute about Governor Perdue. What is your impression of his tenure?
Well, I've known Governor Perdue a long time. He and I are both pilots, and we've had opportunities to experience those fun times together. And I think Sonny has been a good governor. I think that he has his heart is well in the right place, and he's also has been a man of character in his leadership program. Hey, we can all point at things that we would do different from what he's done, but you can take Zell as lieutenant governor, or Zell as governor, or Speaker Murphy as speaker. When you're the one that makes the decisions, you're not going to make them all right. You're not going to make them all to please everybody. But overall, in the whole grade, I think Sonny's been a great governor. He's presented Georgia well. We've experienced some nice growth in our state. He's dedicated to our educational system. So I give him high marks. Same as I would give Zell. All of them. Georgia's been fortunate to have good governors. No scandals. They haven't had scandals in the governors like Louisiana, Alabama, New Jersey.
Hey, Bubba, think about this. Georgia's last 6 governors have come from the General Assembly. So they knew government, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, your best neurosurgeon comes from experience, and that's when you go out there to have your head operated on, you want somebody that has been down the road a little bit. At least I would.
You came out of retirement, so to speak, from politics, back into politics in 2004, was it?
2002.
2002, when you ran for the state senate.
Oh, that was 2004.
2004.
Yeah.
Ran for the state senate. This time as a Republican.
Correct.
You had changed parties.
Correct.
Why?
Because the Democratic Party was collapsing nationally. I haven't voted for a Democratic president since Jimmy Carter. I just my conservative views, my philosophies. I had a change in life in '97 with the right to life issue. When my son got in the funeral home business, and I was sent down to Northside Hospital, and I wasn't pro-choice, I wasn't pro-life, I was just moderate. But when I picked up a fetus to bring to our funeral home, I looked at that and said, how can you do this? Change.
What do you think has happened to the Democratic Party in Georgia?
Bob, I think that it's happened that much about the Democratic Party in Georgia as it is being a Democrat with the way the Democrats at the national level are running the thing. I think you get a drip down position. I mean, there's some great people that have served and are serving under the Democratic label, I guess, just as dedicated as they can be. Sonny Perdue was a Democrat for a long time, just like me. And others, I mean, I can just go down the list in the General Assembly that people have changed. And I think it's been more from the national standpoint. Zell's book, when when he talked about it when he was in Washington. You know, he was very distant from my perspective of him, very disenfranchised with the Democratic Congress, and especially the Democratic leaders in the Senate. And so I think that a lot of that has dribbled down to disarray, and it's happened because the people had changed. You know, Georgia was a Democratic state forever, but it's a Republican state now, and it's because of values and views, and I still think that Washington leads these and causes people to pick and choose.
Back to your relationship with Speaker Murphy. Obviously, you were very close to him.
I was very close to the Speaker. I was not what you would call a Speaker sniffer. I just didn't follow him around everywhere he went. I was there when he called on me. I was there when I had business with him. Yes, had many times to socialize with him, going to the Braves spring training after a legislative session and things, and spending some nice time like that with him. But the majority of our relationship was business. I was a pallbearer at Miss Agnes's funeral when she passed, Speaker's wife, and this was back in the 70s. And Marcus Collins and I were the only two legislators that were pallbearers. I always contribute my relationship with the Speaker getting started with Miss Agnes because, as I said, she took a liking to me, and she was a great lady, but very, very plain, very humble. You know, the Speaker's family never got involved in the legislative process that much. He gave a lot of time to the state of Georgia.
How was he as a leader to the chairman of those committees? He had a lot of committees and a lot of chairmen and a lot of people that he had to work with.
Well, the Speaker told me that, you know, he had to have enough people that he could almost call the shot on to stay Speaker. But he also had to have people around him that would give him the different side of the story. I remember a time that he chastised a legislator from DeKalb County, a Republican legislator from DeKalb County, and I mean, he really got upset. And he turned the gavel over to Jack Connell, and he stormed out of the House chambers. And I got up out of my seat and followed him into the office and sat down, and he was chewing that cigar, and his cheeks were bumping a little bit, you know, and he looked at me, and we sat there probably for 3 or 4 minutes, and he didn't say anything, and I didn't say a word. I just sat there and looking at him. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "Mr. Speaker, you were wrong." He sat there and looked at me again. It seemed like for an eternity, probably 2 minutes. Got up out of his chair, walked out of the office, went back in the House chambers, took back over the gavel at the podium, turned to this legislator and said, "I was wrong, I'm sorry, I apologize."
That was a side of the Speaker that the public
Correct.
never knew. Right.
Loved children, couldn't do enough for children. Senior citizens, couldn't do enough for senior citizens. Speaker's heart was big as gold. Yeah, when he was on the podium up there, he was in charge. But you got 179 egos out there that somebody's got to be in charge. You could go to his office. If you want to see the Speaker, if you were willing to sit there, he'd see you. If you want to ask him a question, he'd answer it.
If you want to ask him a question about appropriations, he'd say, "Go see Bubba."
He was very involved in the budget. The Speaker was very involved in the budget. We'd go down in the budget office and spend hours and hours and hours. I used to hold my committee, not my committee, but the Green Door group. I'd bring them in at 6 o'clock in the morning, because there would be no interruptions, and I could get a lot done in that first 2 hours that it'd take 2 days to get if it was during the regular session hours, because people being pulled out for this and that and the other. And I know the reporter from the AJC that would come in there, and she came up to me at the speaker's funeral and said, "I remember those days you made me come in there." And I said, "You slept most of the time." And he was right there.
If you were in the Capitol at 6 o'clock in the morning, I bet you if you went to the 4th floor, you would find Denmark Groover.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Denmark read every piece of legislation that came through there. He and Benson Ham were the only 2 legislators now. Robin Harris also did that too. Robin was president of Decatur Federal. Sat right behind me in the House in my earlier years. Super guy, just brilliant guy. These are the kind of people that you had an opportunity to work with. And you take a Carlton Caldwell from Blairsville, Georgia, knows what work ethics were, hardworking, solid as a rock, tell you something you could take it to the bank with you. And these are the kind of people that really the Speaker surrounded himself with, and people that I had the opportunity to work with as legislators. I hope it's still that same way. I hope there's a trust factor between colleagues in the legislative branches of government, because you can't be an expert in all fields. You've got to have somebody that looks at education bills and understands your hometown situation, your constituency, and says, I can go to you and I say, "Bob, on House Bill 686, how's that going to affect my school district?" or something like that. And you can help me and tell me that. Bob Bell was another DeKalb County Republican that I remember working with, and Bob was very active in the education side of it. And Bob was a confidant of mine in there, even though he was on the Republican side. I never looked at whether you were a Democrat or a Republican. It didn't matter to me. Get the job done. Let's work together. Let's go. Johnny Isakson and I worked closely together as legislators. We tried to pass CWIP, construction work in progress, when they were building Plant Vogtle, the nuclear plant down there. And of course, the cost of Vogtle went higher than it was intended to do, but still, if that legislation had been processed, we'd have saved the consumers of electricity in Georgia millions of dollars over the years because of the interest in that kind of thing. Make an investment in your future. You can't. I remember when we had the first issue of the World Congress Center, $30 million going to build a World Congress Center. My wife was a classroom school teacher making less than $6,000 a year as a teacher. I don't know whether she voted for me that time or not again to get reelected, because teachers needed pay raises. And they couldn't understand what were we spending $30 million for a World Congress Center, because there was no World Congress Center. It was a vision. You have to make an investment in order to get a return, whether it's in education, whether it's in generating electricity, whether it's in the funeral home business or whatever it is. If you don't make that investment, you can't expect a return.
Marcus Collins.
That's right, Mr. Speaker. Great guy. One of those people that absorbed. Marcus was the sponge. As Ways and Means chairman, everybody's got all kind of legislation that would do good legislation, but on the other side do a lot of harm legislation. And Marcus was the sponge that would absorb that and take the beating of it, especially from the Atlanta press, because he was from Cotton, Georgia. They didn't take the paper down there, so it didn't hurt him with his constituency. Good guy, hard worker, dedicated legislator.
Bill Lee.
A legend in his time. Bill was a speaker sniffer, and a good one for the speaker. Spent a lot of time with the speaker, and very strong confidant of the speaker, and good rules chairman, fair, funny, loved his work, had a good situation working with the railroad, and he could almost be a full-time legislator, Bill, but great guy, good legislator.
Bubba, looking back on your career, what would you consider your brightest moment?
I really think that probably the legislation that passed that did something visually and significant to the county that I served and cleaning up lawlessness, I was very proud of that, and it wasn't easy. That was one of my real tributes that I think. Another thing I did, I introduced the Farm Winery Act that Chateau Elan, and brought all that there, and have seen the change that has taken place, and that what it's done with tourism in our state. Introduced legislation, went to Joe Frank as governor. Joe Frank's a teetotaler, and said, I want to pass where you can buy the product that the winery produces on Sunday without going to a referendum. And Governor Harris said, you can't pass that kind of legislation. I said, Governor, that's not what I came here for. I said, if I pass it, will you sign it? And he said, I don't tell people that I will sign legislation before it gets to my desk. And I said, well, Governor, I need to know, there's no need of me going sticking my neck out like this. He said, Bubba, you can't pass that legislation. See, the tourism, 80% of the tourism was Saturday and Sunday at the winery. But they couldn't sell their product on Sunday. And so I introduced a piece of legislation that gave a farm winery the right to sell their product on Sunday at the winery, not anywhere else, but at the winery. I passed it, and Governor Harris let it go into law.
What do you think has been your biggest disappointment?
My biggest disappointment truly has been not as a legislator or a public service commissioner, but looking now from the outside in, and goes back to that trust factor. I hate to see such controversy, people not working together legislatively, and it seems like it's more now than it was when I was there. And I hate to see that. I don't think it's good for the image of our state. I hate to see our leaders not being able to sit down and solve their personal issues together, so that we had a talk about the Green Door Committee. We had an agreement that we could fight all we wanted to inside that room, go at each other, get your best punch, but we went out there unanimous. When we walked out of that room, we made our case, and we won it. If we lost it, we lost it. But we went out of there unanimous, and it worked. And I'd like to see more of that. I think that's healthy.
How would you like to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered that as a public servant of character, that loved working with people and for people, and hopefully that the footprint that I laid out there had a little something to do with making life better for my fellow Georgians. I've made the statement many times that I've had two major successes in my career in public service. Number one, when I went in public service, I had a small business. And when I left public service, I still had a small business, and it was successful and had grown. And the second accomplishment is that I went in public service with my wife, Sonny, and came home with my wife, Sonny. And I thought those were two, because I've seen some different cases.
Bill Shipp, who you know is a columnist, a political columnist who's been around forever, once said that you are the greatest vocalist the Georgia General Assembly has ever seen. And I want you to make me a promise. I want you to sing at my funeral.
Well, Bob, you know, if it works, i.e. the voice, if it's not cracking and all that, it would be my honor to see you off to that great land. God gave me a talent. I'm not trained. I've sung in 207 weddings in my life. I've sung the national anthem at 2 Falcon football games. I've sung the national anthem at Atlanta Speedway twice. No telling how many funerals that I've sung in. I sang with a dance band at the university when I was there making money. I was choir director in my church for over 20 years, volunteer, love music. Started out at Georgia as a music major. But beyond that, I just, it's something that I enjoy sharing. Usually the people say, well, you sing at a lot of places, don't you? I said, yeah, my fee fits their budget.
Well, you're a great Georgian, and I appreciate you being with us here.
Well, it's just an honor. It's just an honor to write this down, as you might say. And of course, I love the University of Georgia, and I love Georgia. I love my family, and got 3 grandchildren. And it's been a good ride. Lift that cup. It's okay.